Welcome. This is David Boles, Human Meme. Today's topic, traumatic memory and survivor grief. When you create content for free distribution on the internet, you can never really be sure what will hit and what will miss. I have been fooled by myself many times, thinking I had a surefire hit book, or a blog article, or a fantastic podcast episode, or a social media update that turned out to be nothing, if not middling. Then I've had some throwaway ideas. Hey, not everything can be gold, even though we always try to create precious metals forever, that have then taken on a life of their own. In my recent Does Disappeared Mean Murdered podcast, I was pleased with the way the stories of Wendy Heil, Oscar Long, and Gina Boss came together. It was Gina Boss's sister who had contacted me about her story, and I decided to include Gina's disappearance in that podcast. And after that podcast aired, I thought I'd certainly hear from Gina's sister about the story I shared. And when I heard nothing back, I remembered that old Midwestern coldness and that familiar sinking feeling of doing something for someone that goes unacknowledged and unadorned by purpose and aspect, and that there were still people in the world who were perhaps craven enough to serve only their motivations and not the greater goodness of someone else doing you a favor. Survivor grief has many fathers, but only one mother. And then something else happened, something special and unforgettable. My inbox lit up with a new mail notification, and as I read what was sent to me, I was astonished. I was expecting some feedback on my murder podcast from a sister, and instead, I received a beautiful, harrowing email from a stranger. A stranger who is now willing to let me share that letter with you now. But only as long as anonymity in relation would be preserved. I agreed to those terms, because the following is precisely what it means to be human and to create and then propagate your own human meme. Your latest episode of Human Meme was really hard to listen to, as, unfortunately, I could relate to it on many levels. I am not brave enough to talk about it, or even mention what the episode was titled. It is our lingering pain that we carry with us and try to make sense of something that will never make sense, caused by someone who randomly decided to cause pain to a stranger, who to us was and will be a beautiful, gentle soul. Cried for hours after listening to it. It's strange how one word can bring out so many emotions that are still raw and will always be there. Such things do change your view of life, and in our case, knowing, I guess, could mean that we could carry on with our grieving for what will never be again. I know it sounds like I'm talking in Morse code, but I don't like giving out details. The only thing you can feel at first is numb, because our brain hasn't been taught to know how to deal with something so tragic. The flow of routine keeps one going because there is a need for stability, security, and familiarity. I don't even know why I felt the need to tell you this. It just brought out emotions I thought were no longer there. After I asked permission from the author to use that letter in this podcast, I was then asked to include this disclaimer. In case of any ambiguity, I would like to clarify that the person we knew was an innocent victim. He was the gentle soul I was referring to. Just thought I'd clarify because I don't want to dishonor him in any way. And that sort of letter is what it means to me as a content creator to be wickedly, wonderfully, joyfully, sorrowfully surprised when something you write and produce and share and podcast is caught by a stranger and then gifted back into the world as a friend. That touching letter leads us into the next section of this podcast, traumatic memory. And that idea was inspired by my good friend Lieutenant Joe Kenda, star of Homicide Hunter on the Discovery Channel. That is a terrific show. Watch it. I am lucky Joe Kenda is a friend of mine. For the full story on our connection, please visit bolesblogs.com, do a search on Joe Kenda. J-O-E, another word, K-E-N-D-A. And you may also visit boles.com. Click on Archives, then Fan Mail. Scroll down a bit on the fan mail page and you'll see the big size version of the beautiful poster Joe Kenda signed and sent me. Lieutenant Joe Kenda is one of those sworn and warranted people who get paid to leap from the continent and into the depths of the worst of us. And maybe he'll come back, and maybe he won't. In this week's episode of Lieutenant Joe Kenda's Homicide Hunter TV show, airing the same week as my Does Disappeared Mean Murdered podcast, and yes, we know there's no such thing as a coincidence, or as some terrorism experts claim, coincidences take a lot of planning. I choose to believe the connections between Kenda's story and my podcast were not just convenient, but ethereal. Joe Kenda opened his show wide awake in bed, unable to sleep in the middle of the night because of traumatic memory. And he explained to us what he meant by that turn of phrase. Traumatic memory, Lieutenant Joe Kenda shared, is the residual experience of death and murder that haunt you as a survivor or as an investigator. Joe went on to explain that every one of the almost 400 murder cases he worked and solved as a homicide detective for the Colorado Springs Police Department still haunt him, then and now and to this day in his retirement. And how could all those killings not build up inside you, even if you solve them and point to the murderer? Joe Kenda takes murder personally. He seeks revenge for the living and justice for the dead. Joe Kenda is the last stop for a moral reckoning, and he believes it is his sworn duty to solve every case and to allow the living to have answers for the murder of their beloveds. But how does all that death and blood and hatred hang on other people? What happens to the men and women who have to not just solve the murder, but then clean up the blood and try to help soothe the grieving survivors who are trying to make sense of something that will never make sense? it gets to you. It hurts. Training isn't enough. Forgetting doesn't start healing. So, you do your best. But there's no way you can solve every single murder. And so those bodies stare back at you from the grave. When you are on the edge of sleep and waking on the slope of the uncanny valley, and the dead start calling your name and asking for help. Because without you, they cannot seek a just revenge as their killers walk free. That is traumatic memory. That is the curse of those who choose to serve the dead over the living. And it all gets to you in your core, and it grinds you down, and yet you cannot give up or turn in, because without you, that lost life becomes nothing but a statistic on an unsolved ledger line. Some may argue that what Lieutenant Joe Kenda is describing as traumatic memory is really PTSD. And I would kindly argue back, what difference does it make? The symptoms are the same. The end result is the same. The conditions are identical. Only the label is different. And that's what it means to be a homicide hunter, or a coroner, or a police officer, or an EMT, or a sister, or a daughter, or a friend, or a stranger. It all hurts, and it all wounds, and there is no escape from that human fact, that people die unfairly and without cause or celebration, because life is cruel and unseemly and undignified, and death is the utter, bitter end of that good night, and the survivors look for answers in their grief. And those who choose to protect us from that dark night stay up at night, reliving the lives of bodies that are cold and in the ground, still dead, with justice or without. Just because someone else had the gall and the hubris to raise a hand in anger and cleave a life back into the damning bliss, never to be seen again. And here we are, all the rest of us left behind, traumatized by memory and swallowed by the grief of surviving. Thank you for listening. Be a human meme.